Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're tackling something I think we all hear about, but don't really think about too much. The world of microbusinesses. We use the term all the time, but have you ever stopped to consider what that actually means?
It really is fascinating how something that sounds so simple can turn into such a tangled web of ideas when you try to really define it.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to try and do today. We're diving into a 2005 paper by T. E. Gonzalez Alvarado. It's called Problemas en la definición de microempresa, and it was published in the Revista Venezolana de Gerencia. And it really kind of dissects the different ways that people have tried to define a microbusiness, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and really exposes the problems with both approaches.
It's one of those things that kind of makes you realize even these simple concepts we use every day can have these like hidden depths, especially when it comes to the field of economics.
Absolutely. So let's start with everybody's favorite definitions. The hard numbers, the quantitative definitions. So, we all know that organizations like the OECD and ECLA, they use things like employee count, sales volume, and revenue to classify businesses. And we talk about, micro, small, and medium businesses. But the interesting thing is those classifications, they can change drastically depending on the country you're in.
It's almost like imagine if you had a business that was considered medium-sized in Hungary, right?
Yeah.
And then you just pick it up and you move it to Canada. And all of a sudden, without changing anything about how you operate, you're now considered a large business.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So how does this play out in the real world? What's the actual impact of these differing definitions?
Well, I mean, think about it. These varying definitions have a huge impact on things like access to funding, government support programs. I mean, a business owner in one country could apply for a loan and be denied, and then move their business to another country, and with the exact same business plan, they're accepted. Even though nothing about their business changed.
Right. It's a very uneven playing field. It's almost like playing a board game where the rules change depending on which square you land on.
Yeah, exactly. And the paper actually even points out how, like, the EU, when they tried to harmonize these classifications, it actually ended up having a bunch of unintended consequences, especially for existing micro businesses, that suddenly had to deal with a whole new set of rules and requirements.
So it sounds like trying to use just the numbers creates a pretty confusing landscape. So maybe instead of just relying on the numbers, we can try to look at the qualitative characteristics to get a clearer picture.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, because a lot of the qualitative definitions out there, they rely on these really vague terms, things like small or precarious or filling the gaps left by big capital. And these terms, I mean, they're so open to interpretation, and oftentimes they really don't do a great job of actually distinguishing micro businesses from other types of businesses.
Right. It's like saying a shirt is small, but not saying whether it's for a child or an adult.
Yeah.
It doesn't really give us a clear picture of what we're actually looking at.
Exactly. And the paper gives some really good examples. Like, let's say you have a jewelry business, right? Now, that could be a very small business, but a lot of times those businesses require a significant capital investment. And that kind of flies in the face of that stereotype that all micro businesses are these low capital ventures.
So maybe size doesn't always equate to small investments. That's interesting. Are there other assumptions that we tend to make about micro businesses that maybe aren't totally accurate?
Yeah, I think there's this idea that, micro businesses struggle with things like resource management or a lack of skilled labor, when in reality, those are challenges that all businesses face, regardless of their size. It's not really unique to micro businesses.
That is really fascinating. We associate all these characteristics with these micro businesses, but in reality, they span the whole spectrum of business.
Yeah.
What else does this paper point out that might surprise us?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that the idea that micro businesses are just driven by survival needs is kind of a myth. We often think of them as this last resort in a struggling economy.
Right, it's something that only exists in developing countries. This paper is really challenging a lot of my assumptions.
Yeah, and Gonzalez Alvarado actually presents data from developed countries like Italy, Germany, and Switzerland, and it shows how significant micro businesses are in their economic landscape. It's not just about surviving. They actually play a big role.
So it makes you wonder about their impact in a place like the U.S.
Yeah, well, the paper actually highlights a really interesting example from the 90s in the US. And basically, a huge portion of economic activity and job creation came from businesses with under 500 employees.
Wow. So even in these really well-established economies, the impact of micro businesses is pretty significant.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads to this really crucial point.
Yep.
About the economic implications of all these misconceptions. Because if we continue to undervalue micro businesses, we risk putting policies in place that actually hinder their growth
Yeah.
and prevent them from reaching their full potential.
Right. It's like we're building a road, but we're putting this super low bridge over it.
Hmm.
Some cars can get through, but a lot of them are just going to be completely blocked.
Exactly. And this also affects things like access to funding. There's this widespread belief that micro businesses are just inherently risky investments for banks.
Right, because smaller businesses must be riskier, right?
Well, that's what we're led to believe. But the paper brings up this really interesting point, and they talk about the Enron scandal from the early
Uh,
2000s. And basically, all these major banks were tripping over themselves to lend money to this massive corporation, only to see it all come crashing down.
yeah, that was a huge deal. That was a big shakeup for a lot of people in terms of trusting these large corporations.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that, financial risk isn't always determined by company size. Sometimes those big players are actually holding the most volatile cards.
So if we can't rely on size to define a micro business, and we can't rely on these qualitative definitions which are all over the place, where does that leave us? How do we move forward with a clearer understanding?
Well, that's where Gonzalez Alvarado makes this really bold statement. They argue that micro should just be understood as a purely quantitative descriptor. It's a way to denote relative size within a group of businesses.
So instead of getting caught up in all these descriptions and assumptions, we should just be thinking about them as like very small businesses.
Exactly. It's a really subtle shift in language, but it has a big impact because it acknowledges that these are legitimate businesses and that they are actually contributing to the economy in very meaningful ways.
So it seems like the paper is really encouraging us to look past the label and instead focus on the individual business, its context, and its potential.
Exactly, because the real challenges and opportunities that these very small businesses face are influenced by this whole complex interplay of factors that go way beyond just their size.
This has been really eye-opening for me. This whole idea of trying to define something as simple as a micro business.
And this new understanding is so important because it helps us move beyond these oversimplified narratives and actually engage with the real potential of these very small businesses.
It seems like the key takeaway here is that the term micro just doesn't tell the whole story. There's so much more to these businesses than just their size. What else does this paper reveal that might change how our listener views micro businesses?
Well, one of the most compelling points is that a lot of the real opportunities and challenges that these very small businesses face are actually shaped by things that have nothing to do with their size, like access to resources or industry regulations, even cultural attitudes towards entrepreneurship.
Right, it's like assuming every small boat's going to have the same journey,
Yeah.
regardless of like the currents or the weather or the skill of the captain.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why having targeted support and a nuanced understanding of these businesses is so crucial. It's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about creating an environment where they can actually thrive.
So the next time I hear somebody making these big generalizations about micro businesses, I'm going to have to stop them and say, hold on a second. Let's think about this a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think we all need to move beyond those simplistic labels and really engage with the real complexities
Hmm.
of these very small businesses because they really are a vital part of our economic landscape.
Hmm.
And their success is really important for a healthy and vibrant economy.
I think you've given our listener a lot to think about today. This has really challenged my assumptions and made me realize how important it is to look beyond those kind of surface level definitions.
What's really cool about this paper is it's not just about critiquing the existing definitions, it's really encouraging us to ask new questions and approach this topic with fresh eyes.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. It's not just about like summarizing information. It's about prompting our listeners to think critically and engage with the world in a more informed way.
And on that note, I think here's a final thought for our listener. We've talked a lot about how geographical location can really impact a business's classification and its opportunities. So how might local policies and resources need to adapt to actually support very small businesses in different regions, considering these varying definitions and the unique challenges they face?
That's a great question. It really emphasizes that idea of tailoring our solutions to specific contexts rather than trying to rely on these one-size-fits-all approaches.
And we hope this deep dive has given you a new lens through which to view the world of micro businesses. Remember, size isn't everything, and there's so much more to these businesses than meets the eye. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.